I think we still got people joining, but I'll get going and people can join. My name's Stephen Blaney. I'm one of the History Acts Collective and I'm chairing tonight from Sheffield. For those of you who haven't been to a History Acts before, our aim is to connect activists and historians with a focus on how we make history useful for organising in the present. Our topic tonight is one that we've discussed at History Acts a couple of times before. Our first ever session back in 2016, just after the Owen Smith Leadership Challenge, was called Labour's Crisis, and we spoke to activists from Momentum about how the left could consolidate power in the party. Then in January 2018, which now seems like a very long time ago, our title was The Left in Government, and we were discussing the challenges that would face a Corbyn-led government in Westminster after the 2017 election. And now, obviously, after the defeat last year, the election of Keir Starmer, the suspension, and just this minute, apparently, the reinstatement of Jeremy Corbyn, the question we're asking is, what next? And we've got a great panel of activists and historians who we hope can give some answers to that. And we also want to hear from you. So how this works is, first of all, I'll ask our panel to each speak for about 10 minutes each. Our activists will speak first, and then our historians will respond. And then we'll open up to group discussion for the second half of the session. Just in terms of practicalities, if you do want to speak, please write a private message in the chat to me. So just use the drop down to find Stephen Blaney and just write your name and I'll call people to speak in the order that I get names. And if we can keep the chat box to minimal usage so that we can keep track of what people are saying and people's names for the contributions. We're also live streaming this on YouTube, and if you're following on the live stream, you can also type your questions in the chat box there and we'll read them out. And just to let you know that we are recording this as well, and the video will go out later along with a write-up of the event. We'll also be live tweeting tonight, and if you do want to get involved on Twitter, please do using the hashtag HistoryActs. So I think I'll introduce our speakers sort of before they speak. So first up, we've got Becca Hudson. Becca researches and campaigns on criminal justice issues in the UK, and she was involved with the Grime for Corbyn campaign in 2017 and 2019, and more recently, the Fck Boris campaign. I'm not sure if you don't write the U in the name, but I'm pretty sure that's how you pronounce it. So, Becca.
Thanks so much, Stefan. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Becca. Yeah, so that is my background. I guess I've been asked a little bit to speak about the sort of campaigning that I do and what the relationship of the Labour Party was to that when Corbyn was leader, and a little bit about what that might look like now. So as I guess is clear from what Stefan said, most of the stuff that I've done a lot of kind of cultural campaigning, and largely it's kind of been extra parliamentary and community-based kind of campaigns. So they've intersected with the Labour Party at times when it has been mutually beneficial, or when we want them to support something that we're doing, or we want to support something that they're doing. But it's not been the kind of campaigning which has been in and of the party and kind of inside its internal structures and institutions. And before that, I mean, and ongoing now, most of the work that I do is around the criminal justice system. So kind of fighting the excesses of the criminal justice system in terms of racialized policing and human rights abuses in prison. And before that, I worked in the Radical Housing Network, which is a radical housing network, for a couple of years. And so you can imagine that as somebody who worked on housing issues and criminal justice issues, the Labour Party was not always an ally for many of the people and communities that I work with. And the kind of behaviour of lots of Labour councils on housing, particularly in London, was something that many communities that I work with were fighting against. And the excesses, or particularly the kind of hangovers of Blair's Labour in really aggressive and violently racist law and order and anti-asylum seeker policies, was something that, again, a lot of the sort of people that I'm used to working with were fighting against that, and the ways in which the legacies of those policies had devastated their lives and continue to devastate their lives. So I've never had a totally rosy look at the Labour Party. And I suppose from that perspective of doing that kind of work, even when we were doing kind of ostensibly electoral campaigns. So, for example, with Grime for Corbyn, which is obviously for Corbyn, it's kind of explicitly pro a particular political candidate. The sort of way in which those campaigns worked was to meet people where they were. So the members of people who ran the Fck Boris campaign, I'm glad I'm allowed to swear, I didn't know if I had to say F Boris or not, and the Grime for Corbyn campaign, not all of us were Labour Party members. In fact, I think probably the vast majority of people weren't Labour members. But we saw an opportunity for the families and friends and communities that we came from, or the kind of music communities that we came from at particular times. And that made us want to fight with our communities for those kind of things. So Fck Boris, for example, was at first a kind of festival demonstration the day that Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. And then when it became clear that there was an election coming, we thought, well, let's do mass voter registration. And we managed to roll that out to 45 events across the whole of the country, registered thousands of young people to vote. But at the same time, even while the election was ongoing, we often used the parties and events that we ran to do things like fundraise for local food banks, or ask people to bring a bag of food as their ticket to get into a club night, and then that food would later be taken to the local community food bank. And our kind of flagship event we ran at the end of the election in London was a fundraiser for a local youth group who monitor police abuses of power in Hackney. They're called Hackney Account. I recommend checking them out. So we were always aware that we were trying to do kind of two things at once, right? Like what we were doing was quite electoral, but at the same time, we were trying to support community members, and to the best of our ability, we were only kind of small grassroots organisations, to be able to build community power about things that was happening in people's lives at that time. And I guess this has kind of always been my position towards the Labour Party, kind of working with people on what moves them, on the way in which people are being harmed or impoverished in their daily lives, finding accomplices that you can within organisations, and the Labour Party is one of those organisations. It's a vehicle. I think that, you know, it is now clear to us that it's not a vehicle by which the left will be able to take over the British state, but it's a vehicle in which you can have important accomplices and allies for work that you want to do. What does that mean for us kind of more generally? I don't want to be wishy-washy about it, because as I say, we were small voluntary grassroots organisations and campaigns, most of the things that I'm talking about. And in lots of ways that really hampered us. It meant that we were juggling work, study, caring responsibilities, and in our free time trying to scramble together 45 events across the country to do voter registration, or to fight a particular case that had happened where a young drill artist was given a custodial sentence just for performing on stage and kind of saying things which anybody else would be allowed to say. And being able to do that in your free time when you're not actually part of a mass organisation can be very difficult. You know, it's a position of weakness. And I don't want to kind of underestimate the importance of organisation as a way in which the left and which, you know, people's campaigns throughout history have been able to achieve victories. I think it's very important, but I think that the Labour Party is probably not going to be that organisation. You know, before Corbyn became leader, the time was kind of recognised as one of real kind of atomisation and weakness. And I guess that was partly to do with the inability of social movements of those times. So in 2010, St Paul's occupation, even the riots of 2011, to become those kind of mass people's organisations. But I think that that just refocuses in terms of where the left is going, our need to be clear-eyed about the work that needs to be done, the level of crisis that is facing this country, how more and more people are becoming impoverished and persecuted by this government, and the level of movement and of people's power that has to be built in order to kind of try and address that. I do think that we've come a long way in the bad sense since a year ago when Jeremy Corbyn was leader. And again, we have to be clear-eyed about what that means for the Labour Party as an organisation in which we have allies and accomplices. So I would be kind of suspicious of calls for the left to continue to plough all of its energy into the Labour Party and its kind of affiliate organisations. But at the same time, I'm not particularly dogmatic about not working with Labour or putting any energy into it at all. I just think that we have to build serious amounts of power, and we have to do it very urgently. But actually we need a blossoming of many, many institutions and organisations outside of the Labour Party and across the whole of our society to be able to meet just some of the crisis which is already here, and as coronavirus's effect continues to kind of push on and on into society, the oncoming crisis that's coming very soon, not to say anything of the climate crisis on top of that as well. I think in that regard, I would say one thing which has helped clarify my thinking around this is No Shortcuts, which is a book by a union organiser called Jane McAlevey, and I would really recommend reading it. Her basic premise is there are no shortcuts, i.e. you can't just take over the leadership of a party which has the kind of history the Labour Party does, win, and then everything's going to be fine, that you have to build power from the ground up. And so that is what my kind of position now when I'm thinking about what the tasks are for the left, is that we have to continue to build that power. The last thing that I'll say is just, I don't only want to think about what this means for us, I also want to think about what this means for the Labour Party. And I think that we can take the US elections as a kind of warning in this regard, that actually we have seen the kind of centrist, aggressively law and order politics of people like Keir Starmer fail and wither away across Europe. I think that although Joe Biden won the US election, you saw the massive increase in votes that Donald Trump got, despite the fact that he had terribly low approval ratings, despite the fact that there was a global pandemic and almost 2/3 of the US workforce is unemployed. And I don't think that victory of Biden is a good victory at all. He scraped through, and I expect to see a kind of rehashing of almost exactly the same thing in 2024 if Starmer presents the same kind of politics. So I think it's not only kind of our future, but I don't think that the Labour Party has a future unless it's going to push, for the sort of politics that Jeremy Corbyn represents and represented as leader. The kind of socialism that he was fighting for, the staunch anti-racism and internationalism which defined the entirety of Jeremy Corbyn's life's work, and meant that he was, for a huge number of people, a sign of hope which they have not seen in parliamentary politics for a very, very long time. So I think, it's not just what it means for us, but what it means for the Labour Party is that they're not going to have any future and unless they kind of continue this sort of politics and listen to particularly young people, but also swathes of people across the country who are calling for serious radical change.
Great, thanks so much, Becca. Next up, we've got Sophie Wilson. Sophie is currently a Labour councillor in Sheffield and also the chair of Acorn Sheffield. And she was, she was the Labour Party candidate for Rother Valley in 2019. Sophie.
Thank you, Stefan. I'll just start by telling you guys a little bit about me, because I've never spoken at an event quite like this before, so thank you for inviting me. Yeah, I'm a councillor in Sheffield. I'm now the chair of Acorn Sheffield. I was previously involved on a national level. I was on the national board until recently, and I am the ex-parliamentary candidate for Rother Valley. So I was the candidate in the last general election in 2019. I don't have a political background or anything like that. I've never studied politics. My family is not particularly political. I didn't grow up, talking about politics, but I did definitely get heavily involved in Labour because of Corbyn. I did campaign in 2015 and I did join the party straight after that, but I definitely got as involved as I am now because of Corbyn. I grew up on a council estate on free school meals, and it was definitely my experiences in life what led me to be political. And it was the 2015 leadership election that, in a similar way to what Becca was just describing, I finally connected with politics, and finally I could see policies which I believed in, forever and have been talked about, finally being shown in the mainstream. And these, were basic policies, in my opinion, like nationalisation and wealth redistribution via taxation, and generally just a fairer society. But finally, I could see a politician who wasn't interested in pandering to the right in a futile attempt to ride the middle ground for votes. Someone who truly passionately believed in what he was saying and wasn't going to play politics, which, as we know, has damaged the trust that many voters have in politicians for so long. And I voted for Corbyn, and I finally realised that this was a movement. So the kind of the momentum movement, a lot of the other movements that were kind of growing alongside it, this is something that I can actually throw my whole behind. And my story isn't unique, none of it, not at all. This was replicated up and down the country. Thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people probably have exactly the same story about how they got involved. I became a councillor in 2017 and got involved in various left-wing groups and campaigns, one of them being Acorn, and the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign, loads of others that were going on alongside the Momentum movement. And eventually I was selected as a parliamentary candidate in Rother Valley. This was the seat I grew up in. I went to school in it. I had family and friends and a life in this seat. And Labour had never lost it in the 103 years since it was created. This is actually the constituency that Orgreave is located in, and the rest of it is basically a cluster of mining villages. So it is truly a red wall seat. It is the most stereotypical red wall seat I can probably think of, actually. And like I said, we'd never lost it in 103 years, but in 2019 we lost it for the very first time. We lost it to a Tory from London who had been here all of about 4 times since the short campaign period began. So the question I keep asking myself, and I have been doing for the past year now, is why did this happen? Why did an area so affected by Thatcher's legacy, so damaged, so forgotten about, and so inflicted by neoliberalism want to vote Tory after never having done so? And I think that those reasons are actually exactly why we lost it. It was so affected by Thatcher's legacy. One of the big things that I was running a campaign on were the miners' welfare, which were being sold off by the trust that owns them now. Which basically meant that there was no community spaces in the area, so there was nowhere to organise. We actually found running the campaign quite difficult because of the lack of these spaces. There was just nowhere to meet, and that was us actually trying to put the effort in and organise something. Think how hard it is for a community to organise, you know, on issues as they're coming up. It is near on impossible, and so that just seems to have disappeared over the past 20, 30 years. There's not really a variety of opportunities, especially for young people who are moving out in their droves. A lot of my friends now don't live in the area, and that's not because we don't like the area. We don't have a disdain for it or anything like that, which seems to be accused of us a lot of the time. It is genuinely because there's just not much going for us. I had a series of 0-hours contracts in the constituency, and I could see, you know, staying there, we were going nowhere. And it's not the thinking I had when I was younger was not that, oh, I need to move out and move on. It was always that actually we need to fight for change, we need to fight for funding. But obviously, when you're really struggling, like a lot of people are, it can be really hard to organise yourself in that way and to actually have the time to think, what is the root cause of the issue here? As well, on top of that, Labour seemed to have taken the vote for granted. It was going down since Blair's first win, actually, and by the time I was a candidate, we were holding on to a seat by just over 3,000 votes. And none of this breeds confidence in us, and it doesn't breed class consciousness either, and it doesn't breed the will to fight. So really the conditions of the area were not set up for us to win. They were not set up for, you know, an uprising of people saying, actually, I'm done with austerity, I've had enough of this, and actually Corbyn's policies are going to improve the area, might well improve my life. We just didn't have the conditions, and I think before we get to that point, the left needs to focus on changing that. And of course, I don't want to forget about Brexit either. We did sit on the fence with our policy there, and again, that did not create confidence in us. It came up on almost every single doorstep, and it wasn't just a Brexit vote, it was an anti-establishment vote, and that was a sentiment which had been brewing for some time after being let down so many times, and it was a sentiment that nobody really bothered to pick up on. even the left didn't really tap into it. We built our bases. When I was talking about the Corbyn movement, kind of momentum and all the other groups alongside that, we tended to build our bases in metropolitan university city centres. And I'm not going to buy into the the metropolitan elite trope at all, although many people in the red wall seats do. I think that is wrong, and I don't think it is wrong for us to campaign there in the way that we do. There is a vast amount of inequality in those areas, but it is a completely different playing field to the red wall seats, and we need to campaign differently and apply different tactics and think differently, basically. And the red wall seats under the current system, first past the post, we do need these to win, and we do need to take that into account. And I think actually we didn't, and that was a mistake, not just of the Labour Party over the past 10 years, but a mistake for the left as well. So when we look at what next for the left, I think we need to not just look at what Labour have done wrong, because I'm sure everybody in this meeting agrees, that Blair was a neoliberal and didn't take the opportunity to change things for the better in the way that many of us would have liked. But actually, what did the left do wrong too? We've never had discipline as a movement. That seems to be, from my perspective, from egos, stitch-ups, backroom deals, etc., often seem to get in the way. And we didn't expand outwards into these areas and address these issues, like the lack of community spaces. We were so busy engaging with the right of the party on their terms that we didn't move outwards, and in many cases we didn't even realise that we might have to. So going forward, I think we do need to recognise that we're in a completely different ballgame altogether. We've now got a few places on the NEC, but this is vastly reduced from a few years ago. But we do have Starmer as leader. And I'm in a similar position to what Becca was saying, in that I do agree that the Labour Party is important, and I'm definitely going to remain a member, I'm going to remain a councillor, and I'm going to keep on fighting, and encourage anyone else on the left to do the same, because we're really going to need people for selections, which are very important, and getting left-wing candidates to actually enact a lot of that change that we want to campaign on the ground with. But I do think community organising is going to have to be the way forward. We need to build that base for the next election. And whilst this is a crisis and we need to act fast and campaign on immediate issues, we do need to think in the long term as well. So at the next election, I want voters to be in the same position that I was when I saw Jeremy Corbyn. I thought, actually, they're policies that I've been talking about for years, and that's why I want to vote for him. It wasn't something new to me. I was already at that stage. Like Becca said, that was where I was already at. That's where I was already at, and that's why I voted for Corbyn. And I think community organising is the only way to get the rest of the community at that stage as well. So I'll talk a little bit about Acorn, and fighting on everyday issues is our bread and butter. We fight on campaigns that we can win. We assess our own power, who has the power to grant what we want, and we look how to force that hand. And we do this usually through collective action. A lot of what we focused on over the past few years has been housing, renters' rights, so the type of collective action I'm talking about is, physically stopping a bailiff from carrying out an eviction. And every time I do that, I see the power that we have collectively, and I think the rest of our members and people on the street and the people that we fight for see that as well. They suddenly get the feeling that change can happen collectively, and when we stand together, and that actually the status quo can change, which I think is what a lot of the Brexit and the Tory vote was about in 2019. People just wanting a change and thinking Labour, Tory, whatever, it's been the same for me for decades. And we need to show that actually things can change. And I'm not talking, go around the houses and talk in very academic language and talk where we're at. But again, like Becca said, talk where they're at and say, what is the issue in your community? What would you like to change? And I think that's the only way we're ever going to move forward as the left. Like I said, I do think that the Labour Party is the only way to democratic parliamentary socialism under the current system. So it is very important, but we've got to do that groundwork before we can ever win a left-wing government. I just don't think it will ever happen without that groundwork done. And up until for 2017 and 2019, we had not put in that work. There was various groups doing it, but as a movement collectively, the masses of us who were so invested in the Labour Party tended to forget completely about the groundwork, which was, in my opinion now, so much more important. So I'll kind of end it there, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and see what other people have to say and what they're thinking about this topic.
Great, thank you, Sophie. So our final speaker from the activist side of the panel is Chris Peace. Chris is an activist with the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign that Sophie mentioned, and she was also the Labour Party candidate for North East Derbyshire last year. Chris.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the invite and the contributions so far. There will be a little bit of crossover in what I will cover with what Sophie has spoken about, just because we both happen to be parliamentary candidates in very similar areas in the last election. The area where I stood, North East Derbyshire, I spent the time since being selected there in February 2018, was selected as an early selection candidate between then and the election, trying to say that the fact that North East Derbyshire turned Tory in the 2017 election, the election when Labour held on to, you remember the prediction for 2017 that Labour were going to get absolutely trashed, and we didn't. But North East Derbyshire did go Tory then, and I was saying it's a warning just from the listening that we were doing. I'll come back to that, but just very briefly, you know, I came from a family that were Labour supporters. They weren't members of the party, but they basically saw, you know, the socialism of a Labour Party as being, you know, the only party that recognised right from wrong, that was all about dealing with inequalities. My parents both came from very impoverished backgrounds. My mum grew up in an orphanage in Leeds. My dad was brought up away from his family by his grandparents in very, very poor situation. He was working from the age of 12 every morning and then going to school. And really, they got their politics by seeing the Labour Party as somebody who, in their lifetime, brought in the welfare state after the Second World War. They saw those changes. They were both born in the early 30s, and so both did actually see what life was like before a welfare state, before council housing, before the NHS. So that was really my background. My kind of awakening in the middle of all of that was growing up in a mining community during the 84-85 strike. I was 14, was a big school, and everybody in my class had a mining connection, somebody who was on strike. And I can safely say that the whole of that community was 100% behind what the National Union of Mine Workers was fighting for. I often get, you know, accused of looking backwards when I bring up the strike and talking about this. It most definitely isn't history by any means, because what we were learning as teenagers during that strike and what was being said loud and clear was that industrial action was being taken because of the future, because it was fighting against an attack on nationalised industry. The whole political ideology behind the strike was to bring down organised labour and attack on the trade unions so that the path to privatisation would be easier. And indeed it was. And in my lifetime, I saw national industries like water, gas, electric, the Royal Mail, all go into the private sector. And I think if, you know, whilst we may all have our eyes open to the fact that, you know, privatisation will always put profit before people, I think the pandemic, very sadly, has brought this onto the agenda clearly again. I've not been in the Labour Party all my life. Whilst I've voted Labour, I saw my contribution was as an activist, not within the party. I got involved in campaigns that were often alongside what I was experiencing in my workplace. So I was lucky enough to have my education paid for. I do apologise for lauding that, but you know, it didn't cost me to go to university, and I was lucky enough to do that because of that political choice. And I became a teacher initially, which brought me to Sheffield, got involved in my union, the NUT, and subsequently I did retrain as a solicitor, worked in legal aid for a long time, and got involved in the campaigns against legal aid when legal aid cuts started to be brought in, sadly by a Labour government, first of all. I think it's important to remember that. And also I've been a campaigner for youth justice. However, in 2012, the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign was established, and I was immediately drawn to that, not just through my kind of community where I'd grown up, what I'd seen with my own eyes, but also because of the injustice I was still seeing in the criminal justice system and the legacy that is South Yorkshire Police, which is who I was dealing with day in, day out in police stations and in the court. I did join the Labour Party and became more active there. And it wasn't really, I think, until the fact that we did get Corbyn as the leader. And I think when you sit down and you speak with people like my dad in their 80s, and when you're saying to them, I never thought I'd see this, Dad, in my lifetime, and he says back to you, I never thought I'd see it in my lifetime, then I think we know that this was something quite different. And I don't think as disappointing as we may feel, well, disappointed as we clearly are with the loss of 2 general elections, and as disappointed as some of us may feel under a change in leadership and what is undoubtedly a change in direction, I think we do have to try and keep the good points. And this is kind of, you know, I'm not a hopeless optimist by any means. I can be as pessimistic as the next person. But I think we do have to remember, you know, as a Labour movement, you know, 10.1 million people voted Labour in that last election. We didn't win because geographically those votes weren't all in the places where they needed to be to win. But that's up against 13.9 million who voted Tory. So, you know, I don't take that, you know, the Labour manifesto of socialist policies in 17 and 19 was completely rejected. And I don't think we should ever be apologising for our socialist policies. In fact, we should be fighting for them. What we do have to bear in mind, and like Sophie, you know, where we are and what we do in the community, the work that I do for the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign, you know, is focusing and is inextricably linked with the fights that are happening in our workplaces now. I made that connection at the beginning, but we have to look in these areas that we lost to the Tories, ex-mining areas where organised, skilled, decently paid labour has been replaced with insecure work on 0 hours contracts that isn't organised, and it's often on the site of ex-collieries as well, just to make it even more striking. You know, this is where I think we need to make a connection. And I've always been a trade unionist, and I am not saying that trade unions and all trade unions are perfect by any means. But what we have to look is how we organise in workplaces, but how the link with our communities is made absolutely clear. If there's a workplace in our communities where bosses are treating their workers badly, then it is the duty of us as activists to bring that to the awareness of people in communities, you know, and that is a very, very powerful thing when workplace organising and community activists actually come together. It's very powerful because it sends a message out, one that isn't necessarily a Labour Party message, because it's not necessarily organising within the Labour Party. But I tell you what, it then has an impact on what the Labour Party does. I don't see Parliament as the driver of social change. Parliament acts when it's absolutely forced to. And that's where we need to think. We need to keep the pressure on our Labour Party MPs, but we shouldn't be looking for them to be the driver of change. And that's within the party. You know, the membership within the party is the Labour Party. And if it's made perfectly clear that this is a demand from people and it's the right thing to do, then those policies will stay there. I said we shouldn't be apologising for wanting to have, you know, policies that treat, directly manage and change, not manage by any means, that's the wrong word, but change, you know, the vast inequalities that we have. We shouldn't be apologising for that, but we need to give people something to actually build their hopes on. It can't be an abstract thing. It's got to be something where people see that making a difference in their workplaces, in their communities, for their grandkids, you know, and that's where I see my activism and my energy going at the moment. The Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign was not Labour policy at all, but by pressure we are now policy that there will be an inquiry. And I take my hats off to other justice campaigns, like the campaign against blacklisting, like the campaign for Shrewsbury, like the campaign and the inquiry that's ongoing on spy cops at the moment. Those things didn't just get handed down by the Labour Party to become policy. There's because we had supporters continually raising the point, and therefore there is no choice but to make it so. So that's where I see my activism. I will just give two quick shout outs at the moment because I think it's very, very important. First of all, there is a bill going through the House of Lords, the Covert Human Intelligence Sources. This sadly was abstained on by the Labour Party. The Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign, along with other justice campaigns, have made it perfectly clear this, you know, wasn't welcome. We want to see the end of that, because I tell you, it goes a lot further than we have ever seen in terms of actions. And this is an action for any activist needs to be you know, whipping up support against, because it gives a right for people not only to infiltrate political, social and justice campaigns, but to commit crimes and to have immunity for committing crimes against activists in doing so. And secondly, I would just say to keep an eye on what is happening in the Spy Cops inquiry, public inquiry at the moment. There are some very, very dedicated activists who have suffered the ultimate betrayal by the state, who are standing up and fighting back. But even so, it's still proving very hard. So please, if you follow what they're doing, and give them support on social media. So I'll end there, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you, Chris. So we're going to move on now to our historians. So our first speaker from that side of the panel is a returning History Acts guest, and it's John Callaghan, who is Professor of Politics and Contemporary History at the University of Salford. John's written extensively on the history of politics and socialism, including histories of the far left in British politics and of the Labour Party and foreign policy. So, John. You're muted, John.
Yeah, can I say right at the beginning that I've been really interested in the three speakers. Everything that you've said, it's absolutely impossible to tie all that lot together and to come up with something neat and coherent from history. So I won't even attempt that. It would be patronizing to try and do that. Let me just tell you something about myself. I was born in 1952 in Gorton on the east side of Manchester. That was a wholly working class area. It was actually, for a while, it was the biggest constituency in the country by population. It always returned Labour MPs. Nobody else had a chance. As they used to say, you could have put up a pig with a red rosette on and it would have been elected. Such was the nature of the partisan identification at that time. The area was based on engineering mostly, a lot of heavy industry, male dominated, of course. And that was all blown away in the course of the 1970s. It was deindustrialized. There was slum clearance, so we had to move because our houses were bulldozed. The place looked like, in fact, the whole of East Manchester looked like Dresden after the bombing by the end of the 1970s. It was completely flattened. Now, why do I mention all of that to you? Because the first 18 years of my life happened to have coincided with part of what is now called the golden age of social democracy, right? This is when the Labour Party and other parties of the Labour Party type were supposedly at their strongest, at their most successful. But if you look at the facts, and it came as a surprise to me, if you're born and brought up in a working class community, like these red wall constituencies that two of you have been speaking about, you can imagine the whole world is like it is in your neighborhood. It came as a big shock to me when I first discovered, when I was about 19 years old at university, that a third of the working class always voted Conservative. This was in the golden age of social democracy between 1945 and 1970. And in this most successful period for the Labour Party, how many years was it actually in government? It was in government just half the time, 12 years out of those 25 years. And some of its successes, like the one of 1964, were skin of the teeth things. The Labour vote in 64 was about 1% more than the Tories. This was when Harold Wilson first became Prime Minister. So what I'm saying now is this: don't romanticize the past. Let's remember when things were as grim as they could possibly be. Mass unemployment, the rise of fascism. A majority of the British working class voted for the national government, which was effectively the Conservative Party. That's in 1931 and 1935. So we make a big mistake from the outset if we imagine that the working class vote is somehow automatically a Labour vote. Of course, the other thing that I haven't even bothered mentioning yet is that in the golden age, so-called, a majority of women in all social class backgrounds voted Conservative. That didn't change until compulsory all-women shortlists came in, and the allocation of safe seats to women candidates. That was what, after 1987. So the Labour Party, has never ever been a particularly successful party in terms of winning general elections. The most successful it's ever been in terms of winning general elections, of course, was when its leader, Tony Blair, was most removed from socialism, and the trade unions were kept at a great distance from the Labour Party. And of course, nowadays, if you're looking at Tony Blair's legacy, by the way, it's almost embarrassing to be saying that on the positive side, there was devolution, there was a sure start or whatever. On the negative side, there was the Iraq war, hundreds of thousands of people killed. And also, of course, Gordon Brown and Tony Blair's celebration of the City of London as a great success story, as a model of modernity, as a vision of the way Britain would be, a successful Britain. So I suppose one of the things I would say then is that we can easily imagine, because it's there in the history books, times that were as bad as this in terms of the weakness of the left. And all of the things the first three people were talking about were pursued then, rightly so as well. That skepticism that Becca expressed at the beginning, which I share myself, by the way, not wanting to put all your eggs in one basket, and certainly not in the Labour Party. I think that's a healthy condition. And I think I could detect that in the two Labour Party members as well, in the sense that there's not a kind of blind loyalty anymore. What you're doing is fighting for particular policies, for a particular approach, and I think that's right. And also, you're not putting all your eggs in the same basket, in the sense of thinking that the only fight is to somehow engage with intrafactional stuff inside the Labour Party. That way, I think, is complete sterility. You know, that's like reproducing among activists the Westminster bubble, you know, where all the politicos spend all of the time worrying about each other, fighting against each other. So I think it's really a healthy sign that people realise broad-based coalitions are required, pressure group activity, community-based activity. You're absolutely right. All of that kind of stuff is required. And it's also always been true in the past. People have done all these things in the past. And of course, I probably don't need to remind you of these more recent things, but if you look at some of the great changes that have taken place in left-wing politics, if only since the Second World War, nearly all of them begin on the extra-parliamentary left. All the great new ideas, the risk-taking ideas, the risk-taking methods, they begin usually outside of Parliament, don't they? They begin with pressure groups and campaigns. I mean, an obvious example would be something like Charter 88, you know, which initially was only just over 300 people. And they began the campaign for constitutional reform. We didn't get all that they campaigned for, but some significant constitutional reforms, you know, came about as a result of their efforts and winning the argument and so on. Similarly, I think Tony Benn in 1970 already was one of the first Labour MPs to recognise that in the 1960s, all kinds of new left movements had emerged, from feminism, the beginnings of the environmentalist movement, anti-racist movements, movements concerned with opposition to imperialism. These were nearly always outside of the Labour Party. Community politics, actually, was another outside of the Labour Party, which the Labour Party eventually was influenced by. So I think, you know, the sensible view is to not be saying it's either this or that. It should be both. And similarly, since you raised the issue of, there are working class constituencies, so-called red wall constituencies, where the focus is now. And you're probably all aware of the fact that there's a story now to the effect that the working class in those areas is affected by what they call a pessimistic nostalgia, right? So if we just unpack that for a moment, what is this pessimistic nostalgia? The supposition is that working classes in those areas can remember a time when they had secure jobs, relatively well-paid jobs, strong trade union organizations, maybe a sense of community, and even maybe in some cases, a sense of masculine pride that came from those particular circumstances. And there's a nostalgia for all of those things. It's suggested that in the American case, the very way Trump behaved, that macho way he behaved, was something that actually appealed to men in that, you know, in those areas afflicted by this pessimistic nostalgia. But this is a story. And one of the things that I think everyone should always remember is that theories about what is going on are always, at the best, approximations to reality. They're never a perfect match. And it's a big mistake to be seduced by whatever the fashionable theory of the time is. And I'll give you an example of this from history. In 1959, Labour lost its third consecutive general election. And the Labour Party leadership panicked. Hugh Gaitskell and co believed that this was evidence that a section of the working class, a big section of the working class, was becoming more middle class in its outlook, aspirational, individualistic, consumerist, etc., and was buying into the Tories' vision of, you know, an expanding economy, and you've never had it so good. That was the way Gaitskell understood the defeat of 1959. And there was talk, panic-stricken talk, about the need to change the name of the Labour Party, to distance the party from the trade unions, to get rid of socialism, especially Clause 4, because all that was old rot, you know, which no longer had a purchase. And in fact, there was a guy who wrote a book called Must Labour Lose, with a question mark. And the strong implication was, yes, it must lose if it doesn't change its ways. This is 1959. Now, just 5 years later, Labour won the election, a small majority, admittedly, with Harold Wilson talking about 13 wasted years of Conservative Party misrule. In a 5-year period, we're supposedly going from you've never had it so good to a perception widespread that it was 13 wasted years. So it's a warning, don't be seduced by whatever the fashionable theories are, especially if they're inclined to make people feel pessimistic and give up. Because of course, that is one of the things the right always wants us to do, is to pack it all in and stay at home. So can I just finish there? Not because there's nothing more to say, but because there is so much more to say, it'd be a good idea to let somebody else say it.
Great, thanks, John. And yeah, just before I introduce our last speaker, after this, we'll move on to the group discussion. And just a reminder, if you do want to speak, send me a private message in the chat just with your name. And when we come to discussion, I'll call people in order. I've already got a couple of names, so I think there'll be a lot to say, as John says. So our final speaker on the panel is Barnaby Rain.
Hello.
Right.
You froze at the key moment for me. Am I back?
Yeah, you're back now.
Yeah. Okay. Stefan is still frozen for some reason. I'm sorry about that. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me onto the panel. I agree with everything that people have said, but more than that, I also find it very, very educational. So in asking what I can give, similarly to what John was saying, I mean, really, there's most to learn from the experiences of the three activists. But I hope that historians can help in highlighting both what is new and what isn't. So I want to speak about some forgotten lessons from 20th century socialists thinking about the Labour Party in Britain, not in any great detail, but just kind of broad brush why they might be useful, as well as suggesting that this is quite a new moment with quite distinctive challenges. So I want to think about some forgotten things from past that are not so different, and then also those ways in which this moment is new. So I want to start with an experience. I had a strange experience just after the miseries of the 2019 general election defeat. So I work half the year in America, half the year in Britain. And I was going back to America just after Corbyn had lost, and it felt like this strange moment of not just 2015 to 19, but really 2017 to 19, that weird brief moment where suddenly the pundits had to stop laughing at us and begin to take us seriously, because it was really possible that we might be taking state power soon, and these people that they'd always regarded as deranged actually was sort of entering the mainstream, and this wasn't just a blip in the Labour Party. They'd proven in 2017 they could do well electorally. So that 2-year mirage, as it later felt like, after that night in December 2019, I was coming off the back of that high and off the kind of misery that followed it. And then I go to America, and lots of my friends there are really excited about Bernie Sanders, because it was just when Sanders was kind of heating up in the primary, in the run up to the Iowa caucuses. And I sort of shared my depression with a friend and said, you know, this isn't going to go anywhere. You shouldn't put all your eggs in this basket. And he said, well, think about our workplace. I work at a university, and we are involved in unionizing. And we faced a battle for many, many years as graduate students, PhD students who teach to get union recognition. And partly we faced that battle because the president appoints something called the National Labor Relations Board in America that has a lot of power over whether to recognize you as a worker who demands, who gets union rights. And so my friend said to me, you know, we face battles every day to raise signatures on our petitions, to persuade workers to come out on strike, to persuade them to vote for strike action before we can even do that. All of these tiny battles that occupy our day-to-day lives. if only we took the White House with someone who's like us or who sympathizes with us and stuffed the National Labour Relations Board with pro-union people, it would be like, and I remember the phrase my friend used, it would be just like flicking a switch from the top that would change, and everything would tumble down and change from below. And it seemed to me in that moment that this was a very seductive and very dangerous, coming off the back of defeat in Britain, potentially quite dangerous avenue. I was thinking about this today in the midst of Corbyn's EHRC response. So, Jeremy Corbyn released a statement, got him in trouble the day of the EHRC. And then today, in what looks like a deal to get him readmitted to the party, he's willing to kind of roll over and go back on much of the substance of what he seemed to be saying in his original statement. Why? Because it can get him back into the Labour Party, one presumes. And so Labour Party membership card means a very great deal. And I think it means a very great deal. It might seem strange that someone who a few months ago was on the verge of becoming Prime Minister, he might have thought, could now be so sort of humiliated and abandon his dignity in this way, it might seem. But actually, I think those two moments are not so alien, they're really connected. It's the fact, the kind of drug of this thing is the idea that maybe one day if you play it right, you can just walk into the halls of power and flick that big switch from above and change everything. I think the danger is that keeps you in and keeps you loyal in an operation in which it's actually very, very difficult for you to succeed. It's worth remembering the very, very strange historical exception of Corbynism. Not since possibly George Lansbury in the early 20th century has there been someone really from Labour's radical left flank who has actually led the Labour Party. And many socialists in Britain talked about the debates around Corbynism. The most recent comparison people drew was to debates around Tony Benn in the 1980s and whether socialists should join and be involved in the Labour Party to support his deputy leadership campaign. That was a deputy leadership campaign. It wasn't even a campaign for the party leadership. So it's important, I think, a first lesson, a historical lesson, is to think about the exceptional nature of Corbynism as a moment in which socialists from the Labour Party, Tony Benn used to say, the Labour Party is like the church. There are some Christians in the church, there are some socialists in the Labour Party, they're not the majority. The exceptional nature of Corbynism as a moment of the left leading the Labour Party is worth thinking about, because I think a lot of the frames of the Labour left now appeals to unity, for example, the claim that the left is needed for election victory, so the right in the party shouldn't shaft the left. These seem to me like various kinds of wishful thinking that overstate the actual importance of the left in the party and how much Starmer can afford to alienate them. So it's worth thinking then about some specific problems of Labourism. Ralph Miliband used to say, point out that the Labour Party was one of the only party in Western Europe whose name, a left party, whose name didn't even name any kind of ideological tradition. It wasn't a socialist party or a social democratic party. Its name only labelled a demographic. So it's worth thinking about the specific problems of Labourism as an orientation that has always had socialists very much at its margins until Corbyn's rare moment of leadership. And it's also worth thinking about a broader problem of the seductions of a left reformism that says we can just flick a switch from above, and so hides the fact that in truth, the ability to get to a position where you can flick a switch from above tends to depend on lots of movements, as others have said, building strength outside Parliament. So if you want a history of the run-up to Corbynism, it's useless, really, looking at the struggles of the Labour left in the last 15 years, or it's not that helpful. The real sort of build-up to Corbynism was the 2010 to 15 period of a series of social movements that seemed to fizzle out and end in failure, beginning with the student movement in 2010, and then Occupy and UK Uncut, and then what do you know, and pension strikes, for example, in 2011 that really fizzled out. And then what do you know? What are the big items on Corbyn's agenda? The most expensive election item in 2017 is free education, the central demand of the 2010 student movement. The language is all around tax avoidance from Occupy and UK Uncut. And of course, unions being brought back in and the public sector being celebrated opposing outsourcing and demands that clearly fizzled through from the failed public sector pension strikes in 2011. So similarly, in Spain, Podemos came out of the Indignados, the movement of the squares. In Greece, Syriza went from nothing to being a serious electoral force because it took a decision that even other left parties didn't take to support anti-austerity revolts in the beginning of austerity in Greece. France Insoumise and Mélenchon in France was built on the basis partly of pension strikes and antagonism that happened on the streets beyond Parliament. So there's a specific problem of Labourism. There are broader problems of kind of illusions in left reformism that I think would forget the degree to which we depend on on politics beyond just Parliament in order to sustain parliamentary politics. That said, we now face problems for the left beyond Labour as well as in it. So I'm struck that debates about whether to be in or leave the Labour Party, and I agree with, I think, what everyone's kind of hinted at, that this can be a bit of a red herring, this debate for socialists. These debates are today overwhelmingly moralistic. So the question, should we be in Labour, is overwhelmingly answered, in my experience, either by people saying, you must stay and fight. Keir Starmer wants you as a left-winger to leave, so you must stay and spike him. Or, on the other hand, people saying, you must leave because Keir Starmer's so horrible, and look, he's just, you know, tried to abstain on allowing British soldiers to torture people. Isn't that nasty? You must leave because it's a moral stain. These are both heavily moralistic positions, and what the moralism implies to me is the absence of a strategy from either side. So, having just said that it's important not to be drawn in to some of the seductive but dangerous appeals of a kind of Labourism. It's also true, of course, that people on the left outside the Labour Party don't have some revolutionary strategy to capture state power in Britain that is different from Labourism. And actually, for most of my short life so far, the left has been on its reforming and its revolutionary wings without a strategy. The weird thing was that in the 2017 to 19 period, it felt like there was a part of the left that did have a strategy for what it would mean to bring us closer to socialism in Britain, especially on the economic front. Right, John McDonnell and the team of people around him did serious work to try to advance beyond just traditional claims about tax and spend or nationalisation, to try to advance a series of arguments about what structural change in ownership patterns of the British economy would look like that they could do from number 11 Downing Street and from the Treasury. So the weird, just as Corbynism was a weird exception in having at the top of the Labour Party a socialist, more broadly, the weird exception of the last few years was that we broke out of the decades-long paralysis because a section of the left seemed to have a strategy. It now seems to me it's back to the future, right? We're now back in that situation that we were in before 2015 or maybe 2017, where neither the Labour left nor the extra Labour left has much of a strategy. So I just want to say something about why that is. Though, am I out of time, or should I?
No, you've got a couple of minutes. Go on.
Okay. So I think that the problem that's been raised by others so constantly here is the problem of identifying a constituency and knowing what sorts of demands are the demands of the left in our moment. You know, this phrase that was very important to Marx, immanent critique. And immanent critique is where you identify, you don't criticize a particular society by adopting a position external to it and lambasting it morally. Rather, you identify the historical processes occurring within that society that might offer a way to transcend and escape it. And that, for Marx, required identifying a particular group of people who could act as a collective subject and could do the work of transcending that society. When he sat down to write Capital, there were more workers in England who were domestic servants than factory workers, but he wrote about factory workers, not domestic servants, because he thought they occupied a key position strategically. Today, if we look at examples of exciting left resurgence, I've seen in America, for example, the DSA, it's very telling how the Democratic Socialists of America are very particularly geographically focused, and they're not geographically focused in what are constantly in Britain called the traditional areas of left strength. You know, they're focused in multi-ethnic working class inner cities, not in places like near where I live in Queens in New York, and cities like that, not in a sort of red wall areas. So of course the sort of fundamental challenge we have to face is the problem of a class base in thinking about the contrast between a miner in a moment of the miners' strike, where working class people were faced with the might of state power as their antagonist, and developed in the NUM, without romanticizing it, but obviously developed a broadly solidaristic, egalitarian ethic in response to that, you know, most romanticized in something like Pride, in terms of links, the film, in terms of links between miners and other oppressed communities in Britain. I know someone who worked at the time for the Palestine Liberation Organization and was going up and doing meetings with miners, talking about Palestine, an issue that now we'd be told is a kind of Islington issue of no interest to a worker in a red wall seat. But of course, it's not just a lie to say that's of no interest to a worker in a red wall seat. It is the case that an older homeowner in Bolsover today, who has some wealth by virtue of owning a home, might not be the same and have the same class position as they were when they were a miner. And it's notable that in abstaining on bills, as has been mentioned in this discussion, abstaining on bills that would have allowed the state to brutalise the NUM even more than they did, as Keir Starmer abstained on the sort of Spy Cops bill, he was abstaining there, here's the cruel, miserable irony, precisely in order to win votes in these red wall seats. And so we have to be really serious about thinking through the changing class composition and what that means about where our possible constituencies are. Because the background, of course, is that the period from 45 to 75 was really an exceptional period of rising output, a strong economic growth, combined with strong state power for Europe, for old, formerly colonial European states that were still able to have a strong say in the machinations of global capitalism. And that's not the political economy or the geopolitical moment that we inhabit now. And so we face new questions. It's certainly wrong in our changing class composition to think of inner cities as anything other than home to large working classes. And we tend to freeze over complex histories of change, where we talk about Labour's traditional base and forget that Liverpool was not a Labour city for much of the 20th century. Birmingham was once a Tory bastion. So we shouldn't freeze over these histories. And I just want to finish quickly with a sort of classic example of a missed opportunity and of what it might mean to try to think through new alliances and the difficulties that Labourism offers in thinking through new socialist possibilities, which is to raise the scare word, the question of Brexit. So it seems to me that both Labourism's distance now from some of its traditional base and its historic adherence to state apparatuses prevented the Labour Party overwhelmingly from being able, and boxed Corbyn in, to an inability to make a left-wing insurgent campaign that treated the European Union as a concentration of power loathed by people who felt that power was distant and bureaucratic and didn't respond to them, and to treat it as a concentration of power that cared little about people in Hull, and also cared little, frankly, about people in Tottenham, and certainly cares little about migrants who it drowns in the Mediterranean, or about people who use the NHS that it wants to privatise with TTIP. The ability to make that kind of insurgent campaign was curtailed, it seems to me, not only by the Labour Party's present distance from some of its voters in red wall seats who would have told it they were angry and didn't like the EU, but also by Labourism's historic adherence to state apparatus as a kind of reforming moderate politics that ruled out that kind of insurgent campaign. And so we were stuck with a binary between cosmopolitan neoliberalism, here's a leaflet with all the corporate bosses telling you to vote Remain, and on the other hand, xenophobic nativism, here's a poster of migrants, I'm going to tell you we're reaching breaking point, as Nigel Farage said. And we got a split in the Corbynite constituency right from 2016, the constituency that Corbyn relied on linking, which is working class inner cities and working class so-called traditional Labour areas like the Red Wall. That was split right from 2016. And I think it's from there that we see some of the problems that we're now living with. And it was by the failure to make consistently anti-racist and anti-systemic arguments and to be unapologetically radical about it. So those are some of the problems that I think we are now reckoning with today. And I don't have any answers because I don't think anyone does. But if anyone here does, I'm very, very happy.
Great, thanks Barnaby, and apologies everyone for dropping out just before I introduced Barnaby. I don't know exactly when I went out, but my Wi-Fi cut out. Hopefully it's okay now. I'm also aware that I asked you to send your names and then lost the chat, but luckily I did write a couple down before I left. But if you did want to speak, please send your name again. First of all, I've got Millie and then Christian. I'll ask them to speak, and then anyone from the panel, feel free to jump in. So Millie first.
Hi everyone. I'm a trade union rep and housing activist from the working class in the city. I'm going to call myself that all the time now. I like that description that was just used. All right, I got two questions. The first one is a bit like the thing about the big switch in the White House. So people are talking a lot about community organising, also workplace organising. I think that these are very different things from being a member of a political party, because the demand on you, the person, is so much more demand on you. Like the organisations, you have to build them from scratch often. That the time, the energy, personal risk involved, maybe losing your job, I mean, this is not an attack on people who put a lot of energy and hope in political parties at all, but like part of the thing that bothers me is that the thing of the political party is in a way the outsourcing of that. And that's part of the problem, I think, isn't it? That basically people find it really, really difficult to build up a union branch or a local housing group, or like, and sometimes I think people talk about, oh yeah, we need to organise, but I think we need to like really grapple with this difficulty. That's my first question. Right, my second question is, okay, so I'm from London. So what can people do to support community organising in these places where people feel unsupported? People like me, I don't live there. I've never lived there. I'm not from there. It's really long way away. What are people saying that we could actually be doing to support them concretely? Not party politically, but in terms of community organising.
Great, thanks, Millie. So we'll take Christian and then go back to the panel.
Thanks, and thanks to the whole panel. It was really, really great and really good sense of realism all the speeches. And I'm Christian. I teach history at Brighton Uni, so I suppose I'm slightly more on the history count. Although I'm probably going to be on strike to defend IT lecturers' jobs, IT workers' jobs at the uni as well. But anyway, my points were about a question about kind of thinking about socialism and the Labour Party and a bit more, because it seems to me we need to be even more realistic about it, or whatever, more tougher a sense, because we have to see, I think, the Labour Party, Chris, I think it was talked about socialist policies within Labour and or with Corbyn having that, and I think we have to be more realistic. I think we say, look, a good social democratic policies Corbyn put forward. I mean, like getting rid of tuition fees. But essentially, that's going back to what existed under John Major, before Blair. It's not that amazingly socialist just to have free education, where it sounds really radical and socialist now. It should just, it should just be a basic thing. And also the question of the fact the Labour Party is tied up with the role of the trade union bureaucracy as well. It's a political expression of the trade union bureaucracy in many ways, what Labourism is, and that's always going to mediate, but it didn't really with Corbynism, against a kind of left agenda. I mean, I just quote from Ralph Miliband. I've never really apparently said it at a meeting. He said the Labour Party's like an elephant. He says if you all get and push it really hard on the left, you can get it to shuffle a couple of inches off to the left. Everyone pushes really hard. And that's fine, and that's worthy work, and that's great. It's good stuff. But he said to think that the Labour Party is ever going to build socialism or get us to socialism is like expecting the elephant to sprout wings and fly. It's just not what the Labour Party's there to do. And the other thing was just about thinking about 2024, because there's a lot of stress on. I think Sophie talked about 2024 as big target, and obviously, hopefully, Labour the left will manage to keep a kind of anti-austerity sense to the Labour Party going into 2024. But I just wanted to make a point. Starmer, say he wins in 2024, he's going to inherit a massive economic crisis. His traditionally the role of the Labour Party has been to manage capitalism, preside over that, and put the interests of capital over Labour. Blair's government, it didn't need to. The economy was quite good under Blair, relatively speaking. He didn't need to really attack the working class. He declared war, killed workers in other countries and stuff, but he didn't need to go to war on the British working class. Starmer, I think, unfortunately, would have to go to war on the British working class in a way which would make him even worse than Blair. So I just wondered what people thought about that coming battle, even if you get Starmer elected in 2024. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Christian. Yeah, so a lot in those two questions. Anyone from the panel want to jump in?
I don't mind coming in on the what Millie was saying about how hard it is to organise community groups and workplace groups. I'm sure we've all had that experience of how hard it is, and the fact that as activists, we tend to carry a heavy load in terms of how many things we're involved in. But I'd say that a couple of examples which I find really helpful is particularly when it's to do with workplace issues. And it almost goes without saying, but it's got to be worker-led. the trade union campaigning that basically gets nowhere is when it's done from the top, and it's run by trade union officials, and it's worker-led campaigns that actually, you know, do that. And it may well be you do have to be realistic about, you know, what your goals are. But certainly an example is an organisation that both me and Sophie have been involved in, Sheffield. And it's a model that's getting copied now across other areas. It's a campaign called Sheffield Needs a Pay Rise. It's a campaign that's about a lot more than that. But that was basically doing a very long kind of workplace canvassing work, finding what it is that workers are struggling with, what they feel is the worst points of unfairness, and then using that to form the basis, and for those workers to be given a task to go away with. And that task may well just be speaking to one other person in your workplace. And I'm talking about unorganised workplaces, not workplaces where there is even, you know, even a recognised trade union, but any union activity. And certainly there have been a lot of victories over that, whether it's been getting an employer who wasn't paying his workers, actually not paying them. You know, we did one action, and as a result of one action, which was, you know, the workers leading it, and members of the community, immediate community, coming out and supporting them outside this workplace, within 48 hours, that matter had been resolved. It's not dissimilar to what Sophie was talking about with what Acorn does. In terms of community organising, the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign was set up by a very few individuals. And again, we all got some very simple tasks to go away with and come back and do. And amazingly, at the next meeting, everybody had done it. And it's building on that. It's also celebrating other people's victories as well. I'm involved in another campaign, Full Sick Pay Now, which is a campaign of an organisation called Don't Leave Organise. And one of the people involved in that is a McDonald's worker. And he says that, you know, the people that he works with, they now make it a point to go and support other workplace action, because they remember what it was like when people turned up to their first McStrike in their workplace. So it's basically making your goals realistic, making sure it is led by the people who will benefit from the change that you bring about, be that workers or people within the community for whatever the activism is hoping to change, and recognising a success and shouting about it. And sharing that solidarity with other people.
Thanks, Chris. I think, John, were you trying to come in as well?
Yeah, I was going to say something about the fact that the whole point of centre-left parties like the Labour Party was that they were based on the assumption that you did not have to accept in a kind of fatalistic way whatever the economy turned up by virtue of its own autonomous workings. In other words, there was this sense that politics could be put in command. And the point is that that standpoint is an asset only if you can demonstrate in practice, when you're in power, when you form a government, that you can change things. And if you look at the experience of those 13 years between 97 and 2010, the problem there was that there was plenty of extra money spent on education and health and various other things, all of which was blown away in the succeeding period of austerity. But there was very little change that stuck, you know, that stayed. Constitutional change was one of those things, wasn't it? I mean, whatever Blair's motives for that, he probably wanted devolution as a way of preventing Scotland from embracing independence. That was probably the reason he was motivated to introduce it, you know, as a preemptive move. But the fact is that devolution made a structural change which enabled a different dynamic in different bits of the UK. And that's, in other words, you know, to take an obvious example, the power that the Scots have now is rather like a kind of ratchet. You know, you can imagine the Scots wanting more power, but it's very difficult to imagine them wanting to give up the power they've already got. Now, Blair may not have intended that, but there's a structural change that, as it were, the Tories are also stuck with. They're stuck with it. So look at all those areas of economy that the left tends to get preoccupied by. Growing inequality, tax havens, corporate tax evasion. Unless we have answers to questions like that, unless we can actually do something to change those things, unless we campaign consistently with other social democratic parties in other European countries over presumably quite a long period of time to make changes in those areas, they'll never get changed. And that will be one of the ways in which the Labour Party will be regarded by people as a busted flush. You know, it used to stand for income redistribution. It used to stand for a certain level of egalitarianism, but it doesn't now because it doesn't believe it can do anything about the City of London or the tax havens or corporate tax evasion or the redistribution of income. Right, and of course that doesn't exhaust everything, because while we do on this theme, the primacy of politics, they used to call it in academic circles, look at the more mundane side of this, the perception that all politicians are the same. They're all the same. How has that come about? You know, that's come about not just because of the convergence of policy, as it did from, let's say, about 94 onwards, but also because politicians are increasingly career politicians who go from certain universities down a certain career path, and they seem to be a kind of class set apart from the rest of us. These people were at various times in recent years exposed as being increasingly venal, increasingly likely to be corrupt, increasingly interested in money. Blair's a good example, of course, accumulating millions of pounds after leaving office. But I interviewed some Labour MPs during the expenses scandal, and I can tell you that they didn't get it. They really didn't understand why people were furious with their fiddling of expense accounts. They didn't understand that for most ordinary workers, fiddling an extra 10 quid in expenses could get you the sack. They didn't understand that. So here's a kind of modest proposal, that we campaign for Labour politicians to not do those things, to not be like, you know, peas in a pod, all from the same kind of background, all with the same kind of career trajectory. We expect them to be representative of the people they're supposed to be elected by, and we expect them to uphold the strictest standards of probity. And it's very important, this, because of course the right these days is campaigning on a very broad front against all kinds of things that we used to take for granted, like the rule of law, independent journalism, all sorts of things, scientific knowledge, all sorts of things of that order. So there's an agenda. As for 2024, who knows? We live in the most uncertain times that I can recall. I've got no idea what the world is going to look like in 2024. You know, we don't know the impacts of Brexit, for example, could dislocate the economy. We don't know the scale of it. We can expect it to be really bad news, can't we? You know, that's what I'm expecting. So I think we've got to be modest in terms of what we expect the next Labour government to do, should there be one.
John, can I stop you there? Sophie was going to come in.
Sorry, thank you. Yeah, just responding to the questions, the one that Millie gave, what can we do to help community organising outside our own immediate area. And I think Chris is right in that trade union organising and community organising needs to be from the people from that immediate area, and that is how, you know, we'll find the issues that truly matter to people that we can best campaign on. But I think what you can do best is exactly what Chris said, to offer solidarity and to do what they ask. Basically, if they're saying, you know, we would like help on a picket line, then I think that's absolutely the best way to go. But then Christian, I can't see where he's gone now, but I think he was making some great points, you know, sort of questioning if the Labour Party ever can win socialism, and the goal being Starmer elected in 2024. For me, that is a kind of a short-term goal, and I'm happy to work towards that for now. You know, I'm not going to actively work against the Labour Party. You know, and I will go out campaigning and, you know, door knock, etc. And I think a Labour government is far better than the Tories. But as a long-term goal, I don't think 2024 should be endgame. I think it should be a decade or two from now that we're organising towards. And as pessimistic as that sounds, and everybody always gets very annoyed when I point that out and say, you know, we've not got time. And I say, well, if we don't start now, when do we start? You know, when the Labour Party first came about, it wasn't overnight, and it did take decades to even get to that point. And I don't actually see the Labour Party as a way for socialism in and of itself. I see it as a vehicle to create the conditions for socialism, and create the conditions in which the general population kind of publicly consents to socialism. Like I was talking about earlier in the seat I stood in, the kind of the decimation of the miners' welfares and every other community space, an area that we can positively organise in has been effectively destroyed. I think we need to have an agenda that can put that right, and I completely agree. The policies under Corbyn, whilst I was thinking, oh, these are great, they weren't particularly radical. They were just the basics, which is why I'm so annoyed that we didn't win them, actually, because they were kind of the bare minimum I'm looking for. And that was kind of that, you know, 5 years ago I thought this might be the stepping stone to what I actually want. But you know, I now realise we really weren't starting at the bottom, and we've got a long way to do, a long way to go, sorry. Just going back to Thatcher, I know we always bang on about her, but I think she's the perfect example of someone who had long-term goals. Not only did she wreak devastation in the years that she was in power, it's still happening now, and the effects of her policies, in my opinion, are the ones that are often stopping us from effectively organising, whether that be a trade union organising, or like I'm involved with Acorn, which is a community union, so it operates effectively in the same way. You know, it's a membership organisation, and you need to be a member to get defence, let's call it. So it operates in the same way, but the Thatcher's legacy is exactly what has stopped us being more successful. So I think the Labour Party needs to be the vehicle which rights that wrong, so that we can move forward to what I'm sure we all think is real socialism, and what we actually want in the end.
Great, I'll take Robin Sterry and then Chorfi Fatima.
Hi, right, I'm retired at the moment, and I'm not in the Labour Party, never have been, although I've been involved in the Labour movement really since the late 70s. But what I wanted to raise was something that I think the Labour Party and the left in general should be being involved in, is actually building the trade union movement. I think that there has been a big problem in that the nature of the working class has actually changed, but that the Labour Party and the trade union movement haven't adapted to that change. And I'm not just talking about precarious workers here. There's obviously a whole load of new professions such as IT, or, you know, various other what are considered sort of white collar jobs. But there doesn't seem to be very much organising around that. Now, I spent most of my working career trying to organise in the IT environment, and trying to unionise the IT industry. And actually, what you find is that it's very hard work, but you can get there. And certainly in my area, you know, we've ended up being unionised. And with that, you bring in a whole load of different questions, political questions, which can only really be addressed sort of like collectively. And it's also, that was including in areas like consultancies, like in Accenture. And also I had someone who I was working with who unionised Fujitsu in Manchester. And I think it's something which the Labour Party and the trade union movement, and certainly I had problems with the trade union officials who just saw us as being, you know, wiped as being middle class, not worthy of unionising. And I actually think that that's really, really important, because that's where you get the whole sort of collective activity. And yes, you can bring people in from other workplaces, and through that you gain different experiences, and people find out, you know, what's going on in other areas and where there are problems. So whilst not absolutely saying that we shouldn't be dealing with communities, we should also be still trying to build those collective areas in new organisations and new trade unions within the other workplaces, rather than just relying on the existing old traditional manufacturing. I mean, I believe that the figures are something like there's only 13% now of private company workers are unionised, and that's something that we absolutely have to address.
Great, thanks, Robin. Fatima. I think you're muted. Still can't hear you. You seem to be unmuted, but I'm not getting anything. No, maybe if you type your question in the chat box to me, and then I can read it out. While Fatima's doing that, does anyone want to respond to Robin's point about organising in the private sector?
I'm happy to come in with something similar, but that was what Robin was saying was actually kind of a new point, the kind of the white collar kind of IT, but they're still very low paid professionals, I suppose you could call it, and the lack of unionisation there. So that's something I'm going to go away and think about, because it's not something I've thought about that much. But in terms of different trade union organising, as Chris was talking about, Sheffield needs a pay rise, and I think that is exactly the answer to maybe not quite what Robin was talking about, but kind of new industries. So when we were talking about earlier, when in areas where a lot of the manufacturing industries have now been replaced by, at least in my area, like retail, fast food, low paid, precarious work, Sheffield needs a pay rise is great at that. As Chris was saying, we do go round and speak to workers, and we build it. It's built on the model of the Fight for 15 in America, and it's one that really seems to be working, where everyone joins the union at once and they all get into a room at once and really see the power of the collective struggle, basically, and that really seems to be working, and they've made incredible wins in Sheffield. But something I've forgotten, it's not Barnaby, he's gone now, the other historian, I'm so sorry, I'm just getting a mind blank of his name, but was having great points about people's distrust in politicians and the pay scandals and the expenses scandals. I'm not someone who academically subscribes to the idea that MPs should be on a worker's wage, for a whole variety of reasons, and that I think their workers' wage should be raised for everybody. But I think it'd be a great idea, and this is just me, probably never going to happen, if MPs were to not donate a portion of their portion of their salary to charity, as has been the case when MPs have refused either a pay rise or not the full wage, but to donate it to the Labour movement and to the trade union movement as well. And personally, I think trade unions should, I'm not going to say defund the Labour Party, but should perhaps refocus their efforts. And Sheffield Needs a Pay Rise could be replicated in many other cities, because we have a full-time organiser in Sheffield who's actually doing this work, and without that organiser, I'm not sure it would be as successful as it is, if even possible. So we really do need that capital, as sad as it sounds. So I'd really like to see the trade unions refocusing their political efforts away from traditional parliamentary politics, but into agitating and organising and building that left-wing consensus among workers. And perhaps in the same way Robin was saying about the traditional white-collar workers in the offices, something similar as well in terms of how can we use what power we do have to influence that. And there is a lot of money in trade unions, so I just thought I'd throw that out there and see what other people think about that, and perhaps that could also rebuild trust in trade unions and politicians as well, if they were putting their money where their mouth is, basically.
Great, thanks, Sophie. Fatima, I still haven't got a question from you in the chat, but if you do want to contribute, please do type that to me. I've got another question to read out. This is from Eleanor Proctor, and it's off the back of what John was saying about Blair's constitutional reforms, which included the reform of the House of Lords. And Eleanor says, going further, is a reform of the monarchy or even its abolition envisageable under a future left-wing or socialist government? Can socialism and monarchy make easy bedfellows? Does anyone want to come in on that? We've all been watching The Crown, right?
I wasn't expecting to say anything about this, but if no one else wants to, I do think that it's right that British socialists don't, I think, have enough of a sense, or perhaps we're scared to have enough of a sense because we think the public is not on our side on this, of the extraordinary power and damage that a monarchy does as an institution that tells working class kids that they are fundamentally different from the blue-blooded who rule over them, and so writes hierarchy and status into the norms of British society. And so I think that the idea that you can have Prince Andrew sitting down with a BBC interviewer, freely almost admitting to playing a role in child sex trafficking and being quite casual about it because he knows he'll never go to prison for it, I think that has a ripple effect in terms of what it means to grow up as a child in this country and to be told that you're not really an equal citizen, even in kind of traditionally bourgeois standards of what it would mean to be an equal, have a citizen with abstract equality. I do think that's a powerful, important thing. That doesn't mean that it's an easy argument to have, or one that should be prioritized as tactically as an easy fight to win. But I think it's not only anti-democratic, but strikes at the heart of the inegalitarian concentrated power, so that I would like to see a campaign to take back control one day that says the European Union is an awfully bureaucratic, unresponsive, undemocratic cabal that we should free ourselves of, and I'm glad we have done. The same then is obviously true of the House of Lords. Britain's the only country other than Iran with unelected religious leaders in its parliament. And the same is also true of the monarchy, and of all those other aspects, and of Britain's public school system, and of all those other aspects of this society that are an insult to any idea of collective control over our lives and our futures.
Great, thanks, Barnaby. I think we seem to have lost John, so I'll follow up on that. I have Fatima's just question now. She says, don't you think that the Labour Party needs all its components to regain office? I'm not entirely sure what that means. Does anyone want to come in on that? And Annie has a question as well, so maybe we can take both of them at the same time. Annie.
Okay, I'm going to try and move away from the loud baby. But in essence, so Barnaby was talking about the sort of mobilisations which happened in the period before Corbyn's election to the leadership of the Labour Party. And I think one of the sort of massive ones that's sort of not talked about as much is the mobilisations against Protective Edge. pro-Palestinian solidarity, which brought huge numbers of people onto the street in the sort of year before. And a central part of the organisational support behind Corbyn's initial election as Labour leader was anti-imperialist organisers who'd encountered Corbyn in terms of their organising, particularly within the student movement, but more broader than that, or broader than that, sorry. So I guess the question then is, what is the future of the Labour Party, and more specifically of the Labour left, in a context in which these conversations seem to remain about its future seem to remain sort of bordered by UK borders, rather than the question not just of what a left Labour government or a left government, socialist government, could do for Britain, but what that can do in terms of Britain's role in imperialism globally. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks, Annie. Yeah, anyone come in?
I think kind of to both Fatima and Annie's question, I don't know about kind of electoral calculations of what elements of the Labour Party have to be brokered to the perfect kind of calibration, which means that they appeal to exactly enough people to win seats. You know, like, I'm quite skeptical of that kind of electoral math. And I think that a lot of the times, from being involved in the extent that I was in election campaigning, it was when we started to play too much electoral math games and lost sight of the kind of bigger picture, that we lost our way a little bit. And I think that relates somewhat to what Annie was saying, in terms of, I remember a lot with Grind for Corbyn, for example, a lot of media, we had a huge amount of media attention, partly because people thought, well, what are all of these young black musicians? How can they have anything of import to say about politics? And it was more a wake-up call, I think, for kind of like mainstream media to see this as a sort of interesting cultural tidbit that meant that we got as much coverage as we did. I don't think it was that much of a revelation within the music scene. It was more a revelation amongst the kind of, media. And part of what a lot of the journalists said when they came to our events, or when we put them in touch with different artists or people who had attended some of the events, they always said things like, well, you just want free uni, don't you? Or you just like the idea that Jeremy Corbyn's going to offer you this free thing or that free thing. It was all about free stuff, right? And actually, most people who were at the events and most of the artists replied with, exactly as Annie is saying, the premier reason why they first appealed to Jeremy Corbyn first appealed to them, but also that they understood that he was somebody that was consistent, that he was something different that was being offered in the political space, was his anti-imperialism. And for a huge number of people who were engaged in any way with that campaign, that was the main thing. And so again, going back to the kind of electoral math, it may be the case that a massive amount of the British public are in fact not particularly interested in anti-imperialism. It may be that it's a kind of, there are kind of chauvinistic and racist strains across the British public, which can be appealed to both by the Labour and the Tory party. But for a huge number of people, that was the different thing that Jeremy Corbyn offered. And so when we started to do this kind of electoral math game playing, those were the very principles on which people tended to capitulate. It was, well, we don't have to keep these principles here, because if we're pushing the free uni and we're pushing the NHS stuff, then it's okay if we let the internationalism and the anti-racism slide. And I always think that that was a mistake, not just for kind of strategic reasons. I do think that it's a strategic mistake for a lot of other reasons, which I won't go into now. But I think, just on the basis of principle, those are the kind of mistakes that we should avoid making. So I don't know if that means that the Labour Party won't win with its left flank, but, in the same vein as Tony Blair, it may win, but what's the point for us, for people who want a more just world.
Great, thanks, Becca. I've got no more questions in the chat at the moment, so do put your name if you wanna ask one. I might take this opportunity to ask one myself, and it's based on what Millie was saying at the beginning, really, which is about, we've talked a lot about this sort of community organising question and this sort of, the sort of Labour's electoral base recently in cities and the need to sort of organise in non-city communities, particularly in the north, and seats like Chris and Sophie were running? And what can people in the cities do to sort of make that happen from where we are? Because I mean, you know, if I turn up in Rother Valley and start trying to organise workplaces, it's going to be weird, but it seems like we need to sort of use that base that we have in cities to somehow push that forward, and I'm not sure what the mechanism is there. Does anyone want to come in on that?
I kind of similar to what I was saying earlier, kind of help out when required. So there's most of the community organising, so texts I've read and sort of like models that are available, do not encourage people from outside to go into an area for kind of obvious reasons that I'm sure I don't need to explain, to organise the workforce or the community. But I do think that, you know, helping out with funds, and with resources. So, I mean, this could be as basic as helping out with printing, and the knowledge that that you may have from the city centres, because like I said at the very beginning, I don't think we should shy away from what may be a new base for Labour in these city centres where there is vast inequality already. So we absolutely need to organise within there, but we also can't forget the traditional Red War, or at least I'm very much not in favour of that, obviously, because I'm from there and I don't want my area to be forgotten about as it has been. But yeah, just kind of helping out in as basic a form as it may be. It can be just printing and sharing sort of knowledge that you may have gotten from your community campaigns, what's worked well, what hasn't, and sharing that. I think as well, part of the problem is we have organisations which actually cover a large area, and those of us who live on the outskirts, so say for example the Labour Party or even Acorn, those of us who live on the outskirts are expected to travel into the city centre for meetings, and this has been covered hundreds of times. But I think it is just as basic as sometimes being willing to move out and about, and that doesn't mean kind of, you know, invading a community and knocking on doors and saying, you know, you should subscribe to what I'm saying and my point of view, not at all, but making links with the activists that are already there and offering them help and support, because like I said, we don't often have the resources or the spaces to organise, so that it could be just as simple as that, you know, helping out with fundraisers, really basic kind of solidarity in action is, I think, the best way to go in this circumstance.
Yeah, go on, Chris.
Well, similar to what Sophie has said, and it is that sort of what skills are that you can offer. I completely agree with Sophie that, you know, if anything succeeds, it's run and owned by the people who you know the success belongs to. But, you know, if you have got skills that can help, so for example, in North East Derbyshire, you know, there's a lot of people who are keen to do stuff, but it is a much older demographic of an area. It just is. It's got the lowest number of under 25-year-olds of electoral age in the country. And it's very much, you know, people want to do stuff, but they haven't got the IT skills. They don't know how to set up a Facebook page. So you're not directly going in and running somebody's campaign, but you're actually there to help as and when. Fundraising is really important because, you know, we forget that, you know, people that often fight the most are people who have the least resources, be that time or even money to put into campaigning. So, you know, we had great support for campaigns that we were doing from people in the centre of Sheffield who would organise a fundraiser to go into campaign activities in North East Derbyshire. So, you know, things like that. It sounds perfectly, you know, acceptable to do that. That's not crashing in on somebody else's campaign, but it's being there to support. And finally, I've been really thinking about Robin's question. It's just been preying on me about this, you know, trade unions missing out. You know, public sector membership of trade unions has actually gone up, but private sector is static. And I think, you know, one of the things is maybe just trying to, you know, if there's not enough within your workplace to get something going. It's maybe trying to make links with kind of co-workers in other similar places and trying to establish a kind of a sharing of you know, common issues and common problems, to use that as a starting point. You know, organising in those places, it's not going to be fixed, even if trade unions say, right, we're going to target, you know, this particular private industry. It's still got to have that kind of, you know, worker-led element to it. And I just think, you know, sharing hardships and sharing successes with people in similar positions is extremely empowering.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. That's really useful.
I've been on that one.
So, seeing as we don't have any questions left, and yeah, so what we normally do at the end is we go back to the panel just for some final thoughts. We still don't have John. I've messaged him, but I can't find him. Oh, just before we do this, so warning to the panel, I will be coming back to you for final thoughts, but Robin just wanted to come back in on what Chris said.
Chris, I mean, what I was thinking though was it's actually up to every individual rather than relying on other people to organise. I mean, the workplaces where I've been, quite often there haven't been any union people at all. But the point is that you join the union and then you build up, and there will always, I mean, even in the sort of the white collar type jobs, there will always be conflicts with management. We're as exploited as any other workforce, as any other members of the workforce, you know, for our ability to labour. We will come up into conflict with management, and those are the opportunities that you use, apart from generally talking about politics and talking about, you know, unions, but those are the times when you show from your own action that things can be changed. And then from there, you build more and more people as they see things changing. And so, I mean, you can end up being quite dominant. I mean, in one of my workplaces in Accenture, although we weren't formally recognised, pretty well everything had to come through us because we were so strong. And certainly in Fujitsu, they ended up, you know, being recognised there. So even though you as an individual, it's really important that people do it for themselves rather than waiting for the trade unions to do it, because they won't, or sadly the Labour Party, because they won't. So I think it's down to all Labour Party members and members of the left to go and actually take responsibility and do that for themselves.
Great, thank you, Robin. That's great contribution to end the discussion on. So the way we do this for the final thoughts is we go in reverse order to how we started. So I'll go to Barnaby, then Chris, then Sophie, then Becca. Unfortunately, we seem to have lost John permanently. But yeah, Barnaby, wrap us up.
Oh, it's been a great discussion. I don't know that I have very much to add in closing. I think we are at a point without many answers, and perhaps it is an advantage of the left in our moment that I think many people at least know that we don't have many answers. I think we should be open about the fact that neither the Labour Party nor any groups outside the Labour Party have ever built socialism in Britain. I mean, if you have my kind of politics, you think that actually no one's ever successfully built socialism anywhere. Others on the left may disagree with that. So I think that some humility from everyone is in order. It's easy for me as someone who comes from political traditions that were outside the Labour Party until I joined briefly under Corbyn. It's easy for me to sort of pour cold water on the huge limitations that the Labour Party presents as an institutional vehicle for the realisation of socialism, without acknowledging that radicals outside the Labour Party have, you know, political traditions I come from never numbered more than, say, 10,000 members. The Communist Party in Britain, not even that much more than that. So I think that humility is required now, both because the past has been a difficult one and also because the present is a particularly difficult moment, because many of the models from which we derive our thinking about strategy today are 20th century models that rely on an expanding, growing economic base forged around an industrial proletariat in a particular global configuration in which Western European countries and the United States, countries of what we now call the global north, still wielded an enormous amount of power over the processes of global capitalism. And the spatial, post-colonial spatial shift in the organization of global capitalism, which weakened the power of an organ like the British state relative to global capitalism, transformed the class composition of British society and also the possibilities for social democratic change led by the British state. And so I think we have to try to engage that in thinking very creatively about what socialist strategy means in a moment in which neither the old revolutionary model premised on a working class subject that has never delivered its insurrectionary potential in Britain after about 1926, nor the social democratic model premised on a working class subject that seems to be transformed as well in our moment. Neither of those two things can offer easy answers. So I'm just here with that kind of humility, not having answers, but having lots of questions about the way forward, and not thinking that either Labour Party members nor non-Labour Party members should believe that they have the answers to building socialism.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I won't be as eloquent of that as that. Basically, don't get caught in energy traps. There's a lot of things that are complete energy traps out there. So, you know, if you're in the Labour Party, you know, it's like breaking news on the hour, something to kind of get enraged or anything about. Don't get caught up in it. Be active in where you can actually influence. Don't rely on the Labour front bench to change the direction of politics within the party or for the country. Make them rely and have to act on what we do as a movement, and get active in your trade unions. You know, even if you are no longer working, get active. You know, some trade unions do have retired members. Benches, Unite do have Unite Community. And also, one thing that does seem to get forgotten, get involved in your local trades council, because you've got kind of everybody coming together there. And I think, you know, trade councils serve and do a great deal of good when people actively bring things to the table. You know, otherwise it just becomes a talking shop. And to be quite frank, if you get involved in too many talking shops, they're energy traps as well. So, and celebrate any victories on the left, in the movement. Be loud about it, because the right are.
Great, thanks, Chris. Sophie?
Yeah, similar to what's been said before me, but again, even less eloquently, I'm gonna suppose. But yeah, absolutely celebrate the victories, and it's not all doom and gloom. And in the past 5 years, I think we have made great wins in some areas. I've been involved in some great campaigns that we've won that I'm really proud of, and that can motivate you onwards and upwards, can't it? So carry on like that, rather than it can seem very depressing right now, and you can get very caught up in it. And similarly, when we're organising, kind of, we've talked a little bit about the constituencies and who is the working class now, and how has that changed. And I think it's important that we can all go back to our own communities and examine that, because it will be wildly different. My experience will probably be wildly different to many people in this Zoom call today, and that's okay. That, you know, our how we identify what class we belong to, and that doesn't make that any less valid just because it isn't as rigid as it might once have been, or perhaps it never was that rigid. We just always suppose that it was. So maybe go back and identify those groups and where we belong, and also what's stopping us progress. I think I know some reasons in my own area. I've talked a lot about the community spaces and the ability for us to organise, and the kind of the time factor. A lot of us are very trapped, working very, very long hours and unsociable hours now, actually. So it can be really hard to actually just speak to your neighbours and talk about what's going on in your lives and at work. So think about those barriers and what can we do to immediately change that so we can move forward in the long term. And there's nothing wrong with working towards what might seem quite small goals, because if we all do that, then at the end of the day, I think we've made quite a big difference. So my message is just to not lose heart and to not give up yet.
Great, thanks Sophie. And finally to Becca.
I just want to say thank you so much to everyone from History Acts for organising this, and thank you to everybody who's given part of your Tuesday night to hear us all sit here and talk. I guess just for closing, I think, so I was sort of thinking of what Millie had said in the first question, which was that people say that doing community organising is talked about all the time, and I think that's really true, and it connects to a lot of what Barnaby was saying about there being absence of strategy, and I don't think that just saying organise community organising is a sufficient answer to that absence, and it does take a huge amount of work that being a member of a political party might not necessarily take up in terms of your time and energy, even though that's not necessarily true. As we know, there's lots of people whose time and energy is completely consumed by the Labour Party. So, it's about how much energy you want to give it. But I kind of think that's the reality of organising. And actually, when people know that the stakes are that high and they also believe that they can win, and they feel that they are part of something, people do give that much time and energy. And I think that those of us who are already committed to kind of bringing about those conditions have to think about what that might look like. And, also in John's absence, I'd just like to reiterate what he said about the fact that we are in a very volatile political time. Things change very quickly. I think it's a huge reason for hope that we've seen some of the largest anti-racist mobilisations in this country's history this year in the middle of a global pandemic. And that's not something to be downplayed. That was a huge kind of historical shift that has happened, and we don't know what will happen in the coming months. Decades can happen in weeks. So I think we have to stay primed to see where that kind of volatility takes us. Know that it does take a huge amount of work and energy, and just be kind of realistic and strategic about where we put that energy and where it's going. But know that there are many other people who, when they believe that they can win and they can see that there's routes to winning through what the left offers, people will come on board and they will also be able to give their kind of time to those campaigns, because a lot of times our lives depend on it.
Great, thanks so much, Becca, and thank you to all the panel and to everyone who came and took part. Just before we go, shout out to our next session, which is going to be in 2 weeks on the 1st of December, where we'll be talking about activism around food poverty. So yeah, do keep an eye on the website and on the Twitter. But yeah, thanks again, everyone, and thanks for coming. Cheers.